Picture this: you're at a glittering ball in 1863 London. The chandeliers burn hot enough to melt the wax before it hits the floor. Violins are slicing through the air. Every eye is trained on the shimmering sea of silk and taffeta, skirts so wide they need their own postal codes. And somewhere inside one of those skirts, a woman is trying not to panic. Because under that satin dome sits a private problem no etiquette book will admit: nature doesn't care about fashion. Now, imagine trying to navigate the world's most complicated bathroom situation while wearing what amounts to architectural engineering. The dress isn't a dress, it's a system, layers upon layers that turn a human body into a traveling pavilion. First, a thin linen shift, the breathable base that keeps the expensive fabrics from touching skin. Then the corset, tugged and laced until your waist looks elegant and your lungs file a formal complaint. Over it, petticoats. Not one. Not two. Sometimes 6, each adding volume and bounce, like stacking parachutes. And then, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the crinoline. A cage of spring steel hoops suspended by fabric tapes, expanding the skirt into a perfect bell. 6 feet across. That's the width of a modern couch. Walking becomes geometry, angle, pivot, glide. Sitting is negotiation. Doorways are boss fights. Quick question for you: could you walk through your apartment with a 6-foot hula hoop around your waist, and keep a poker face? Comment, "I'd try," if you think you could last 5 minutes. So, bathrooms. If you're picturing a discreet powder room with subway tile and scented soap, think again. In the early Victorian decades, indoor plumbing was a luxury, not a guarantee. Even grand homes relied on chamber pots, commodes hidden in furniture, and retiring rooms staffed like pit crews. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. There were rules. There were systems. And they were so discreet that a well-bred woman could vanish from a ballroom for 5 minutes, reappear glowing, and no one would ever know how much choreography just happened. Let's talk hardware. The chamber pot was not a joke, it was precision. Oval, shallow, with a curved interior that fit neatly beneath a forest of petticoats. Quality models had tight lids to signal status: closed meant, handled; open meant, attend to this. Wealth disguised necessity: chairs with secret compartments, marquetry cabinets that hid multiple pots, commodes that looked like heirlooms from a duke's library. Everything was designed to whisper, never shout. The operation itself? Equal parts ballet and engineering. A lady didn't simply lift her skirt. She commanded 20 pounds of textiles and a steel exoskeleton. The move had a name in some households: the tilt. You stand, turn slightly, and let gravity and hoop spring do their quiet work while a maid, trained like a pit lane mechanic, guides the oval pot into the pocket of space under the cage. Fabrics are fanned, folded, and screened like stage curtains. A hand mirror is kept nearby, not for vanity, but alignment. There is eye contact. There is silence. There is victory. Tell me honestly, does that sound more stressful than parallel parking? Vote, Team Crinoline, or Team Street Parking. Here's the twist that blows modern minds: for a good slice of the century, many women didn't wear what we'd call underwear. Modesty was measured in yards of fabric, not briefs. The skirt was the privacy. But as crinolines went bigger and wind became the uninvited guest, fiascos happened. Picture a gust turning that bell into a flipped umbrella. The solution was as clever as it was practical: split-crotch drawers, 2 pant legs tied at the waist with a purposeful gap. Coverage for modesty, access for logistics. No fast removal. No wrestling with buttons. Just strategy. Meanwhile, toilet paper as we know it didn't show up in mass market form until late in the era. People improvised: newspaper squares, catalog pages, soft rags laundered with linens. Wealthy women favored fine linen cloths, washable, absorbent, endlessly folded. One more task for the invisible labor force that kept the household running: launderers, ladies' maids, seamstresses, the silent engineers behind elegance. And then there was the monthly marathon. Menstruation lived in a vault of secrecy. The T-bandage system, a belt with straps, held layers of absorbent cloth, or moss, or wool, depending on what you had. On heavy days, some women might change a dozen times. Imagine doing that inside a wool-lined umbrella of steel while pretending to enjoy someone's story about a cousin's cousin in Bath. You're starting to see it, right? The Victorian lady's life wasn't just about beauty. It was logistics. Timers. Fluid intake calculus. Friend networks. Coded phrases like, "Shall we step to the retiring room?" that signaled a small crisis disguised as a social grace. The more extravagant the fashion, the more brilliant the workaround. Because the truth is brutal, the world did not bend to women. So women bent reality around themselves. Here's why this matters now. When we talk about history, we point at the big stuff: wars, laws, kings. But daily life, the unglamorous, human part, is where ingenuity hides. The crinoline wasn't just fashion, it was an engineering problem solved on the fly, 1,000 times a day, by women who refused to let basic biology derail the performance of public life. Their solutions were discreet, elegant, and sometimes jaw-dropping. And in the background, cities were changing. Sewers were being dug. Plumbing was creeping into row houses. Retiring rooms at theaters became less theatrical and more functional. The culture was inching towards something we'd recognize as privacy. But until it arrived fully, women built their own. Before we go deeper, drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where you're watching from. New York, Dallas, Portland. If you're somewhere windy, you've already got empathy for 1860s London. In part 2, we're going inside the retiring room, the VIP lounge of Victorian survival, where maids worked like NASA mission control, and one misstep could turn a silk fantasy into a public nightmare. We'll talk secret furniture, the teacup cough, scent protocol, and why a single misplaced pin could humiliate a duchess. Imagine you're at a ball hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire. The music swells, silk shoes scrape across parquet floors, and gentlemen bow with just the right level of disdain for one another. But for the ladies? There's another drama entirely, one that takes place behind the velvet curtains of the retiring room, a sanctuary that wasn't just about powdering noses. Step inside and you'll find a chamber that looks more like a salon than a bathroom. Gilded mirrors. Fainting couches. Perfume bottles glinting in lamplight. Everything carefully designed to suggest luxury while disguising necessity. But behind those curtains and decorative screens, the true battlefield of Victorian elegance. These rooms weren't optional. They were survival stations. Imagine trying to dance 3 quadrilles, sip champagne, and flirt with Lord So-and-so while wearing 20 pounds of fabric and a rib-crushing corset. Nature eventually wins. And when it did, women slipped away with a practiced smile and a coded phrase. "Excuse me, I must retire for a moment." That was the Victorian equivalent of today's, "Be right back." Inside, the pit crew was waiting. Maids trained in the choreography of fabric and steel. Their job? Manage the unmanageable. They'd fan out the layers, guide the chamber pot, and repack the entire contraption in record time. They knew every trick, where to pin a skirt to keep it lifted, how to shift a hoop without clanging it against furniture, how to slide a pot in and out so silently you could swear it never happened. Think about it, these women weren't just attendants. They were engineers. If you've ever watched a Formula One pit stop, you know the vibe: speed, silence, precision. Only here, the stakes were dignity, not horsepower. Now let's get personal: odor. Yes, the Victorians worried about it just as much as we do. Chamber pots came with lids. Maids carried small sachets of dried lavender, rose petals, or orris root, sprinkling them discreetly into the pot before it was whisked away. A well-placed scent could mean the difference between a lady's reputation for refinement, or whispers behind her back. Here's a fun detail: society ladies often mastered what was jokingly called the teacup cough. Picture this: a lady gently raises her teacup or handkerchief, lets out a polite cough, and in that moment, her maid quietly adjusts fabric, slides the pot, or makes some essential movement. The cough masked the sound, the handkerchief masked the smell. It was practically theater. Quick question for you: what's harder, keeping a poker face during a Zoom meeting when your dog barks, or hiding the fact that your maid just slid a pot under your 6-foot skirt in front of a roomful of dukes? Comment Zoom or Victorian below. The furniture was equally ingenious. A chair might look like a velvet throne but open its seat to reveal a perfectly fitted chamber pot. Cabinets carved with cherubs could hide 2 or 3 pots stacked like porcelain secrets. These weren't crude, they were status symbols. A wealthy household could boast a commode designed by a famous craftsman: mahogany, gilt trim, even hidden locks. Owning one was almost like owning a luxury car today: discreet comfort, hidden engineering, bragging rights. But here's the real kicker: sometimes, the retiring room wasn't private at all. In theaters, at balls, or in large estates, multiple women might use the space at once. Picture it: half a dozen hoop-skirted figures, each with her maid crouched like a soldier at her post, all of them working in synchronized silence. Conversation carried on in soft voices, as if nothing unusual was happening. One lady might be asking about a cousin's engagement while another, inches away, was mid-operation. That's Victorian composure. And when disaster struck? Oh, the scandal. There are recorded cases of skirts getting tangled in the crinoline hoops, of pins slipping at the worst possible moment, of chamber pots tipping over during a clumsy retrieval. Imagine standing in a satin gown worth more than a year's wages and hearing that unmistakable clatter. The kind of sound that freezes a room. And yet, most women learn to recover instantly, smile fixed, voice steady, as if nothing at all had happened. The training was mental as much as physical. Society didn't allow failure. A woman who lost control of her dignity risked gossip, ridicule, even social exile. That's why these systems had to be flawless. Retiring rooms weren't just places to relieve oneself, they were arenas where grace was tested, where invisibility was the ultimate art. And here's a detail most history books skip: in some grand houses, servants weren't just emptying chamber pots, they were recycling. Waste had value. Urine could be sold to tanners for treating leather or to industries that extracted saltpeter for gunpowder. In other words, a duchess's most private moment might indirectly fuel a cannon. History is wild like that. Pause for a moment. Imagine you're back at that ball. You've just danced with a lord whose boots cost more than your annual budget. Your corset is squeezing the life out of you. You excuse yourself, glide into the retiring room, nod at your maid, and in 60 silent seconds, the operation is done. No one saw. No one knew. And when you step back into the ballroom, cheeks flushed, posture perfect, the illusion remains, elegance unbroken. That's the Victorian secret. Beneath the surface of glitter and grace lay systems so elaborate, so fragile, that one mistake could ruin everything. And yet, women carried it all off with smiles, laughter, and the practiced confidence of survivors. In Part 3, we'll go deeper into the accidents, the myths, and the shocking public incidents that forced Victorian fashion to evolve. Because trust me, once skirts started catching fire, flipping upside down, and even killing women, society had to rethink whether walking architecture was worth the risk. Victorian elegance looked divine in paintings and photographs. But on the streets, in crowded ballrooms, or even at home by the fire, it was a ticking time bomb. The crinoline, the very symbol of mid-19th century fashion, wasn't just inconvenient. It was lethal. Picture a cage of steel hoops covered in highly flammable fabric, sweeping inches above a roaring fireplace. Now picture candles on every mantel, lamps fueled by whale oil or kerosene, sparks flying from carriage wheels on cobblestone streets. Women were essentially walking lanterns, waiting for a single spark. And it happened. Over and over again. Newspapers of the time are full of tragic reports. In 1861, a young woman in Dublin leaned too close to the fireplace and her crinoline caught instantly. The flames raced upward, trapping her inside the steel hoops. She didn't survive. That same year, in Boston, 3 women were burned alive at a party when one guest's skirt brushed against a candle and ignited a chain reaction. By some estimates, thousands of women across Europe and America died in crinoline fires. Here's the part that makes your stomach turn: many deaths weren't immediate. Some women managed to rip off their corsets and skirts, only to be left with terrible burns. Hospitals of the day weren't equipped for modern burn treatment. What followed was weeks of agony. And yet, Despite the horror stories, society refused to abandon the fashion, at least, not right away. Beauty still trumped safety. Quick question: would you rather wear something dangerous but gorgeous, or ugly but safe? Be honest, comment style or safety. Fire wasn't the only enemy. Wind was another. Gusts could flip a 6-foot hoop skirt like a giant umbrella. In 1858, one London paper reported an incident where a lady was swept completely off her feet, carried several yards, and dumped unceremoniously onto the pavement, petticoats in the air, reputation in tatters. Cartoonists had a field day, sketching women tumbling across streets like tumbleweeds. And then there were accidents with machinery. Picture a woman stepping too close to a factory floor, a printing press, or even a horse-drawn carriage. Those wide hoops could snag in gears, trap under wheels, or catch on nails. In one particularly gruesome case, a woman's crinoline became entangled in an industrial machine. The outcome was too awful to print in polite papers, but word spread fast: fashion could literally tear you apart. The medical community noticed. Doctors began publicly criticizing the crinoline, not just for accidents, but for its effects on women's health. Corsets already restricted breathing, compressed ribs, and displaced internal organs. Add 20 pounds of fabric and a steel cage, and fainting became a daily risk. Doctors called it crinoline syncope, passing out mid-conversation, mid-walk, mid-everything. Some ladies carried smelling salts in jeweled bottles, pretending it was a charming quirk of femininity. But really, they were oxygen-deprived. And yet, society adored the silhouette. Women were praised for floating like angels, even as their clothing sabotaged their every step. Here's where the public disasters became impossible to ignore. Newspapers began reporting mass accidents. Theater crushes where women couldn't squeeze their skirts through exits fast enough. Some were trampled. Street disasters where skirts knocked over market stalls or sent candles flying. River drownings when women fell into water and their crinolines ballooned, trapping air, dragging them under like anchors. Yes, you read that right, fashion that made you sink. By the 1870s, society finally began to rethink. Enter the bustle. Instead of full-circle cages, fashion shifted toward projecting volume behind the body, leaving the front and side slimmer. It was still impractical, but at least less likely to turn its wearer into a human torch. But before we leave the era of death by fashion, let's talk about embarrassment. Because while tragedy grabbed headlines, humiliation was the daily battle. Ladies caught in sudden gusts, skirts flipping high enough to scandalize entire neighborhoods. Petticoats tangled in carriage wheels, forcing women to be cut free by horrified drivers. Even Queen Victoria herself once reportedly complained that navigating narrow staircases in Windsor Castle was nearly impossible without bruises. And beneath it all, that secret layer of split-crotch drawers, which made accidents even more mortifying. If a skirt flipped too high or a hoop collapsed, the risk of exposure wasn't just fabric, it was flesh. Cartoonists, always hungry for scandal, exaggerated these mishaps in biting illustrations that still survive today. They mocked the very women forced to live inside these cages, while society pretended it was all elegance and grace. Stop for a second. Think of the confidence it took for women to walk into public spaces knowing every step carried risk, of fire, of collapse, of humiliation. That's not weakness, that's bravery in a corset. In Part 4, we'll peel back another layer, the hidden economics and servant networks that made these bathroom strategies even possible. Because behind every graceful Victorian lady stood an army of maids, laundresses, and seamstresses who made sure the illusion of elegance never cracked. And the truth about their lives is just as fascinating, and brutal. When you picture a Victorian lady floating into a ballroom, remember this, she didn't get there alone. Behind every silk gown and polished pearl stood an invisible workforce, women who didn't have the luxury of lace and chandeliers, but whose entire lives revolved around maintaining them. Because let's be real. No one woman could single-handedly manage a wardrobe that weighed as much as a toddler, required furniture to sit down, and demanded an entire protocol just to pee. The illusion of elegance was a team effort. The lady's maid, the quiet engineer. At the top of the servant hierarchy stood the lady's maid. She wasn't just a dresser, she was a technician. Her skills: corset lacing, fabric folding, crinoline wrangling, hair arranging, stain removal, and emotional damage control. She knew the precise tension at which a corset could make her mistress's waist look fashionable, without causing a fainting spell at the wrong moment. She could fold 10 pounds of skirts into a carriage seat in seconds. And, most importantly, she was the guardian of secrets. Think about it. Every chamber pot operation, every menstrual accident, every stain or tear, she saw it all. And her silence was priceless. Many aristocrats treated their ladies' maids like confidants, because betrayal meant social ruin. Some maids, in fact, became so trusted that they wielded quiet power, pulling strings behind the curtains of grand houses. The laundresses, the unsung heroes. Laundry wasn't just work in the Victorian era, it was a war. Imagine Great Wash Day, an event so grueling it happened only a few times a year in many households. Clothes were boiled, scrubbed with lye soap, beaten, wrung, and dried on lines that stretched across gardens and yards. Now add menstrual cloths, chamber pot linens, sweat-stained corset covers, and undergarments washed far more frequently than outer dresses. Laundresses carried the most intimate burdens of Victorian life. Their hands cracked from lye, their lungs filled with steam, and their backs bent under hours of hauling water. Yet without them, the illusion of freshness and refinement would collapse. The seamstresses, stitching survival. If a skirt hem ripped at a ball, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. That's why seamstresses worked constantly, repairing, reinforcing, and reshaping the elaborate gowns. Hoop skirts bent out of shape, petticoats tore, drawers ripped. And when fashions shifted overnight, seamstresses were the ones who transformed wardrobes on impossible deadlines. Many seamstresses were paid miserably, sometimes pennies a day, laboring in cramped rooms lit by smoky oil lamps. Some were children. Their work literally propped up the image of wealth and grace, but they lived in poverty. The bathroom battalion. And then there were the maids who worked the retiring rooms, the bathroom battalion. Their job: silent efficiency. They managed chamber pots, fetched water, adjusted skirts, sprinkled lavender, and slipped away unnoticed. They were expected to move like ghosts, always present but never acknowledged. Here's the brutal irony: while wealthy women worried about fainting in corsets, these maids worked 14-hour days, hauling buckets, scrubbing chamber pots, and breathing in the stench of chemicals. If Victorian fashion was a castle, servants were the foundation stone, buried, invisible, holding everything up. The economic machine of elegance. Supporting one fashionable lady could employ 1 to 2 personal maids, several laundresses, at least 1 seamstress on retainer, a household staff to empty chamber pots and fetch water. Now multiply that by dozens of women in wealthy families. The economic impact was enormous. A single trend in women's fashion could create, or destroy, jobs for hundreds. When crinolines were at their widest, steelworkers were kept busy producing hoops. When bustles replaced them, demand collapsed, and entire workshops closed. Fashion wasn't frivolous, it was an industry that fed on labor. The silence of the workers. Here's the dark truth: these women, the maids, laundresses, and seamstresses, rarely appear in the official records. They were invisible by design. Their names weren't written in society columns. Their labor wasn't acknowledged in fashion magazines. Yet they were the ones who kept the system functioning. And the irony? Many of them could never dream of owning even a single gown they maintained. Some slept in attic rooms barely big enough for a bed, yet spent their days smoothing silk worth more than their lifetime wages. Pause for a moment. Imagine being the maid at a ball. You're kneeling on a marble floor, hands deep in your mistress's skirts, maneuvering a chamber pot while violins play above. The air smells of perfume and sweat, your fingers are raw from laundry soap, and you know tomorrow you'll do it all again. Grace wasn't effortless. It was extracted. Quick poll: do you think you'd rather be the one wearing the crinoline, or the one managing it? Comment: wear, or manage. Neither was easy. Both required endurance. The hidden training. Girls learned these systems young. Mothers taught daughters how to tilt, how to cough at the right moment, how to fold skirts to avoid fire. Servants trained each other in silent gestures, coded signals, and the art of being invisible. It was a shadow curriculum of survival, passed down in whispers. In Part 5, we'll see how all of this, the deaths, the accidents, the silent labor, finally began to spark reform. Because once women started riding bicycles, working in offices, and demanding real independence, the cage of steel hoops and secret chamber pots could no longer contain them. By the 1870s, the world was shifting. The glitter of the ballroom still mattered, but cracks were spreading through the empire of steel hoops and silent chamber pots. Because outside the walls of parlors and theaters, the world was demanding something fashion had denied women for decades: mobility. The first crack came in the form of the bustle. Instead of full-circle cages that made women look like bells on legs, the bustle pushed all the volume backward. From the front, skirts looked slimmer. From the side, they curved dramatically like a shelf jutting from the hips. It wasn't perfect, walking was still tricky, sitting still required strategy, but it was a step. Women could at least fit through doors without rotating like ships in a harbor. Doctors, reformers, and critics sighed in relief. The bustle was still ridiculous, but at least it didn't kill women quite as often. Newspapers joked about moving mantles when women walked by, but the horror stories of crinolines catching fire slowly faded. Then came the bicycle. Yes, the humble two-wheeled invention changed fashion more than any designer ever could. By the 1880s and 1890s, bicycles were exploding in popularity. Women wanted to ride. They wanted freedom, air, motion. But you can't balance on two wheels with a 6-foot skirt. Enter bloomers, baggy trousers gathered at the ankle. Practical, breathable, scandalous. Critics fumed that women in bloomers were abandoning modesty. Cartoonists mocked them as manly. Ministers declared it the end of civilization. But the truth? Bloomers meant independence. Suddenly women weren't prisoners of fabric. They could travel on their own, without carriages or chaperones. Can you imagine the thrill of pedaling down a dusty street, air in your lungs, knowing you weren't trapped inside a steel cage anymore? Comment, bike, if you'd have joined the revolution. By the late 19th century, more women were entering the workforce: clerks, typists, teachers, shop assistants. Try fitting a crinoline under an office desk. Impossible. The demands of daily labor forced fashion toward practicality. Skirts slimmed. Layers thinned. Corsets loosened, though not without a fight. And then came World War I. Factories, hospitals, farms, all needed women. You can't roll bandages or work machinery in a hoop skirt. Fashion bent to survival. Skirts rose. Waists relaxed. For the first time, women's clothing was designed to let them move freely. While fashion was transforming, so was the infrastructure. Indoor plumbing spread from the wealthiest estates to middle-class homes. By the late 19th century, flushing toilets, once an exotic curiosity, were becoming a fixture. Retiring rooms turned into proper bathrooms. Chamber pots were banished to attics. For women, this was revolutionary. No more silent tilts over hidden commodes. No more maids carrying linen bundles to the laundry under cover of night. Privacy was finally possible. Hygiene improved, dignity improved, and for the first time in centuries, women could handle basic needs without a pit crew of servants. Here's the part people often miss: the change wasn't just physical. It was psychological. For generations, women had been trained to hide every natural function behind walls of fabric and silence. To smile while suffocating in a corset. To cough politely while a maid adjusted a pot beneath their skirts. To pretend their bodies didn't exist. But with bloomers, bicycles, offices, and bathrooms, a new idea took root: maybe women could be visible as human beings. Not just fashion monuments. Not just angels in the house. Real people who walked, ran, sweated, worked, and lived. And make no mistake, it terrified society. Critics howled that women were losing femininity. That freedom would make them ugly. That practicality would unsex them. But the tide had turned. Once women tasted mobility, there was no going back. Think about it. In 1855, a lady couldn't sit down without engineering support. By 1920, women were voting, working, and wearing skirts short enough to show ankles, once a scandalous fantasy. In just a few generations, fashion went from cages to freedom. And here's the kicker: every absurd hoop, every chamber pot ballet, every secret teacup cough laid the groundwork. Because it proved women could adapt to anything. It proved they could survive systems designed to trap them, and then shatter those systems when the time came. Let's ask, which era would you rather live in? The glitter and danger of the crinoline age, or the freer, riskier modern world of bloomers and short skirts? Comment crinoline if you choose beauty at any cost, or modern if freedom wins. So, let's step back for a moment. We've traveled from secret commodes in velvet chairs, to skirts that doubled as death traps, to bicycles and bloomers that shook society. But the story of how Victorian women managed the bathroom, hidden, awkward, ingenious, didn't just stay in the 19th century. It rewired the world we live in today. Think of the sheer creativity Victorian women had to develop. Split-crotch drawers. Tilt techniques. Teacup coughs. Furniture with hidden chambers. Lavender scent protocols. These weren't accidents, they were systems born from necessity. And they taught an entire generation of women something powerful: when the world refuses to accommodate you, you build your own strategies. That mindset, quiet, invisible problem solving, laid the groundwork for broader innovations. Fashion eventually adapted, plumbing advanced, etiquette evolved. But it all started with women who refused to let impossible clothing and impossible expectations break them. Ever wonder why we use euphemisms for the bathroom, restroom, ladies' room, powder room? That's Victorian legacy. Direct words were considered vulgar. Respectable women never admitted to natural needs. They retired. They freshened. They stepped away. We still echo those codes in our language. Even the idea that bathrooms should be private sanctuaries. That grew from the humiliations of the chamber pot age. Once women gained actual enclosed plumbing, privacy wasn't just luxury, it was dignity. And society embraced it. Victorian bathroom struggles weren't just about hygiene. They were about power. The crinoline made women dependent, on servants, on furniture, on men who could fund wardrobes heavy enough to crush a ribcage. But the backlash, the bloomers, the bicycles, the offices, wasn't just about style. It was about control over the body. When women demanded freedom of movement, they weren't just asking for easier skirts. They were demanding equality in daily life. If you can't walk, how do you vote? If you can't breathe, how do you speak? If you can't pee without a team of maids, how do you claim independence? Every stitch of reformed clothing, every demand for plumbing, every laugh in the face of critics moved women closer to saying, we're not just ornaments. We're people. And here's something that blows my mind: those chamber pots, emptied daily by silent servants, helped spark the sanitation revolution. When cities grew filthy with human waste, disease spread like wildfire: cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Reformers pointed to the hidden reality behind glittering homes: without proper sanitation, even the rich were vulnerable. By the late 19th century, engineers and public health officials were demanding real solutions: sewer systems, flush toilets, clean water. The suffering of Victorian women, trapped inside impossible fashion, dependent on chamber pots, was part of the larger pressure that forced modern sanitation into existence. When you flush your toilet today, you're living in the legacy of their struggle. Close your eyes and picture it. A Victorian ballroom. Gilded mirrors, chandeliers dripping light, violins in the air. Women glide across the floor like living sculptures, steel cages under silk, corsets cutting into ribs, perfume masking sweat. Every smile hides logistics. Every graceful turn conceals strategy. And yet, beneath the suffocating fabric and suffocating rules, something stronger burned: resilience, ingenuity, survival. The knowledge that someday, skirts would slim, corsets would loosen, doors would open, and freedom would arrive. This isn't just a quirky story about old-fashioned toilets. It's about what happens when society builds cages, literal or symbolic, and tells women to smile inside them. The Victorian answer wasn't surrender. It was creativity. Quiet resistance. Solutions so effective that they outlived the age itself. So next time you slip into comfortable jeans, hop on a bike, or lock the door of a private bathroom, take a second to honor the women who came before. Women who danced in steel cages, who whispered codes to maids, who lived in fear of fire and gossip, yet somehow carried themselves with elegance that history still romanticizes. Because behind the romance was strategy. Behind the elegance was exhaustion. And behind every chamber pot was the determination to survive with dignity intact. That's the real legacy of Victorian bathroom culture, proof that even in the most restrictive systems, human ingenuity can turn survival into art. Speech balloon, now tell me, what shocked you most about Victorian life? Was it the fire hazards, the teacup cough, or the fact that chamber pots literally powered wars? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you loved this dive into the weird and wonderful world of history, hit subscribe. Because next time, we're going even deeper, into a story of medieval dining habits so disturbing, it'll change how you look at your dinner plate forever. Thanks for staying with me till the end. You've just survived the cage, the corset, and the chamber pot. Welcome to the other side of history.